The air in the Prairie Ridge Town Hall on October 12, 1887, was thick with the scent of wet wool, kerosene, and the cloying sweetness of impending fear. Outside, a premature autumn snow, thin and sharp as ground glass, swirled against the tall windows. Inside, the faces of the 40-odd men who constituted the town's leadership were grim, etched with the familiar anxiety of a high plains winter. They had gathered to discuss the fuel crisis. The summer had been unusually wet, the wood poorly seasoned, and the railroad spur that was meant to bring coal from the east had washed out in a September flood, with no hope of repair until spring. They were, in short, facing a catastrophe with a dwindling pile of damp logs. It was into this assembly of hardened farmers, ranchers, and merchants that Alara stepped forward. She was 17 years old. Her husband Thomas had been taken by pneumonia the previous winter, a winter that had been mild by Dakota standards. Her parents had succumbed to a fever 2 years before that. She was an orphan, a widow, and, in the eyes of the men who now turned to regard her, a child. She owned 3 small, contiguous buildings at the edge of town: the one-room cabin she lived in, the derelict blacksmith's workshop Thomas had been trying to revive, and a small, sturdy storage shed. They were all she had in the world besides a small savings of $47 in silver coins and a collection of books and schematics left to her by her grandfather. "Councilman Abernathy," she began, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the tremor in her hands. "Gentlemen, I have a proposal." Josiah Abernathy, a man whose considerable girth was matched only by his sense of self-importance, shifted in his chair. He ran the town's general store and held the mortgage on half the farms in the county. His word was law, and his patience for diversion was thin. "Speak your piece, Alara. We have important matters to discuss." The implication was clear. Whatever she had to say was not one of them. "The problem is not merely the scarcity of fuel," she stated, ignoring the patronizing tone. "It is the inefficiency of its use. Each household maintains its own stove, its own fire. Each stove requires constant feeding. Each chimney bleeds the majority of its heat into the sky. We are fighting the cold with a dozen tiny, wasteful battles instead of one concerted effort." A murmur went through the room. This was not the sort of talk they expected from the quiet, bereaved girl who kept to herself. She sounded less like a citizen with a concern and more like an engineer delivering a lecture. "My proposal is this," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "I will construct a single, highly efficient heating system based on the principles of the Roman hypocaust and the masonry heaters of my grandfather's homeland. A central firebox, an extended flue system running underground, and a series of radiating surfaces. With one well-managed fire, I can heat all 3 of my buildings for the entire winter, using less than a third of the wood a single one of your homes would consume." For a moment, there was only silence, the kind that precedes either ridicule or revelation. In the Prairie Ridge Town Hall, it was always the former. A coarse laugh erupted from a rancher in the back, followed by a wave of chuckles and condescending smiles. Abernathy held up a hand, a gesture of magnanimous authority. "Child, your grief has addled your senses. Heat rises. That is a law of God and nature. You propose to send it sideways? Through the frozen dirt? It is a fantasy. The smoke would back up and poison you in your sleep. The fire would go out from lack of a proper draft. It is the most fanciful bit of nonsense I have ever heard. The draft is a function of the temperature differential and the height of the chimney stack, not the horizontal distance of the flue, provided the gradient is correct," Alara countered, her voice sharp with the precision of recited fact. "The earth itself will serve as an insulator, a thermal mass, holding the heat and preventing it from dissipating. The flue will be over 30 feet long, terminating in a chimney on the far side of the workshop. The principles are sound. They are centuries old. Centuries old and best left forgotten, Abernathy scoffed. We have modern iron stoves, not Roman dirt tunnels. We are not savages scratching in the earth. You will waste your time, your meager savings, and what little fuel you have on this flue of folly. He turned to the rest of the room, his voice booming with dismissive finality. Now, as to the matter of rationing the town's wood supply, she had been dismissed. The men turned away from her, their backs a wall of obstinate ignorance. Not one of them had asked to see the drawings her grandfather had left. Not one of them had inquired about the mathematics of thermodynamics she had spent the last 2 winters studying by candlelight. And not one of them, as they debated whether a family of 4 should be allotted an 1/8 or a 1/10 of a cord per week, would admit the chilling possibility that they might be wrong. Ilara stood there for a long moment, invisible in a room full of eyes, then turned and walked out into the biting snow, the laughter a faint, ugly echo at her back. Her vindication would not come in words. It would be built of clay and iron and stone. The work began the following morning, on October 13th. The ground was already stiff with the season's first frost, making the initial labor a brutal, unforgiving affair. Her plan was meticulous, born of her grandfather's detailed notes and her own careful calculations. The heart of the system would be a large, cast-iron firebox she had found half buried in the abandoned workshop, a relic of some failed enterprise. It was pot-bellied and rusted, but its walls were a solid half-inch thick. She spent the first 2 days cleaning it, using a wire brush, lye, and immense effort to scour away the corrosion, revealing the solid, functional heartwood of the iron beneath. She paid a boy 2 cents to help her haul it into the center of her small cabin, positioning it on a newly laid foundation of flat field stones she had gathered from the creek bed. This stove was not a commercially produced model. It was a brute, likely intended for a forge, capable of holding a large, slow-burning fire for many hours. It cost her nothing but labor. The most critical and costly component was the flue itself. After consulting her grandfather's diagrams, she determined she would need 32 feet of 10-inch diameter vitrified clay pipe. A trip to the next town, a full day's journey by wagon, was required. The merchant at the rail depot, a man named Henderson, looked at the young woman, her face smudged with soot and determination, and quoted her a price that was offensively high. She did not haggle. She simply counted out $27 in silver, nearly 2/3 of her entire savings, and supervised the loading of the heavy, fragile sections onto her buckboard. The journey back was fraught with peril. A cracked pipe would be an irreplaceable disaster. She patted them with straw and drove the old mare with painstaking care, her knuckles white on the reins. With the materials on site, the true labor commenced, the excavation. The trench for the flue had to be dug with absolute precision. It would run from the base of the stove in her cabin, pass under the dividing wall into the blacksmith's workshop, travel the full length of that building, and then pass under the far wall to terminate at the base of a new chimney she would construct on the exterior of the workshop. The trench needed to be 18 inches wide and, crucially, 4 feet deep, placing it well below the frost line that could reach 36 inches in a hard Dakota winter. Furthermore, it required a consistent, gentle upward slope, a rise of exactly 1/4 inch for every foot of run, to encourage the flow of hot gases. A steeper grade would pull the heat through too quickly, wasting fuel, while a shallower one risked a poor draft. She did not own a surveyor's level. Instead, she fashioned one from a length of board, a piece of string, and a lead weight. For days, from sunup to sundown, the rhythmic scrape and thud of her shovel and pickaxe was the only sound from her small plot of land. The topsoil was manageable, but a foot down she hit a layer of dense, clay-like glacial till, studded with rocks. Each stone had to be worried out of the ground, some so large she had to use a long plank as a lever to pry them free. Her hands, accustomed to mending and cooking, were soon a raw landscape of blisters that broke, bled, and hardened into calluses. Men from the town would walk by on the road, pausing to watch the solitary girl toiling in her trench. They would shake their heads, sometimes calling out a piece of mocking advice. "Digging to China, Alara?" one shouted. "You'll find more warmth that way." She never dignified them with a response, simply wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of a gritty glove and continuing her work. By the end of the first week of November, the trench was complete. It was a perfect, uniform channel, a testament to her relentless precision. Now came the assembly. She mixed her own mortar from lime, sand, and water, a formula specified in her grandfather's journals for its ability to withstand high temperatures. Working in the cold, she had to heat the sand and water on a small outdoor fire to keep the mortar from freezing before it could set. One by one, she lowered the heavy sections of clay pipe into the trench. Each bell and spigot joint had to be perfectly aligned and then sealed with a thick, generous application of the warm mortar, smoothed by hand to ensure an airtight connection. This was the most critical phase. Any leak would mean a catastrophic failure, bleeding precious heat into the earth, or worse, allowing smoke to escape into the buildings. She worked with the focus of a surgeon, her movements deliberate and economical, her mind entirely consumed by the task. Once the 32-foot length of pipe was laid and the mortar had cured for 2 full days, she began the process of insulation. This was the genius of the old design, a concept the townsmen with their thin-walled stovepipes could not grasp. She first filled the trench with a 6-inch layer of dry sand, carefully sourced from a bend in the creek, which she had hauled bucket by bucket and left to dry on tarps in her cabin. The sand would create a uniform, dry barrier against the damp earth. On top of the sand, she packed a 2-foot layer of crushed rock and gravel, creating a massive, dense core around the flue. This was the thermal battery. It would absorb the intense heat from the flue gases, holding it long after the fire in the stove had died down, and radiating it slowly and evenly upwards, warming the floors of the buildings above. Finally, she backfilled the trench with the excavated earth, tamping it down layer by layer until the ground was level once more, hiding the secret that lay 4 feet beneath. The final piece of the construction was the chimney. It stood on the far side of the workshop, a stark, vertical statement at the end of the long, horizontal flue. She built it from fieldstone, using the last of her lime mortar. It was not a work of fine masonry, but it was solid, broad at the base, and tapering to a height of 16 feet, tall enough to clear the roof peak and catch the prevailing winds to aid the draft. The connection between the underground pipe and the vertical chimney base was the most complex joint. A carefully angled junction she sealed with a double layer of mortar and a collar of packed clay. Inside the buildings, the modifications were simpler, but no less clever. In the center of the workshop, directly above the buried flue, she constructed a long, low bench of brick and stone, about 18 inches high and 10 feet long. The top was capped with smooth, flat soapstone slabs she had paid a premium for. This bench, known as a kotao in her grandfather's language, would become a giant radiator, warmed by the flue beneath it, providing a place to sit, to work, or to dry clothes. She cut a simple register into the floor of the small storage shed, allowing a portion of the radiant heat from the ground to warm that space as well. Her own cabin would be heated directly by the massive iron stove itself. On November 28, 1887, nearly 6 weeks after she began, the system was complete. She had spent a total of $38.14. She had excavated over 12 cubic yards of earth by hand. She had lost 9 pounds from her already slender frame. As a final preparatory step, she used the last of her money to purchase a large quantity of oats, flour, and salted pork from Abernathy's store. He tallied her bill with a smirk. "Stocking up, are we? I hope your grand tunnel keeps the larder from freezing. You'll have little wood left to cook with after you've fed that monster." Alara simply met his gaze. "It will be sufficient," she said, and left with her supplies. That night, she lit the first fire. She started small, using a handful of kindling to gently warm the vast, cold mass of the flue and chimney, a process her grandfather's notes called curing the draft. A wisp of smoke puffed back into the room. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought of Abernathy's mocking words, of failure and poison. Then, as the column of air in the 16-foot chimney stack began to warm and rise, a gentle but inexorable pull began. The smoke reversed course and was drawn smoothly into the stove's opening and away into the hidden channel. The system was breathing. She slowly added larger pieces of wood, building a steady, hot fire in the belly of the iron stove. She placed her hand on the stone floor of her cabin, then walked into the workshop and laid her palm against the soapstone bench. At first, there was nothing but the familiar chill. An hour passed, then 2. Doubt, cold and sharp, began to creep into her exhausted mind. Had they been right? Was it all a colossal, ruinous folly? But she held to the principles of thermodynamics. It would take time to heat the immense thermal mass she had created. She banked the fire for the night, trusting in the science, and went to a cold bed. When she awoke just before dawn, the air in her cabin was not just free of a chill, it was comfortable. She walked barefoot into the workshop. The soapstone bench was radiating a gentle, pervasive warmth that filled the entire cavernous space. She pressed her hand to it, and it felt like a living thing. It had worked. December arrived, and with it, the winter's true character. The temperature plummeted, and the prairie winds began their relentless assault. In the town, the daily conversation revolved around the dwindling wood piles. Fires were kept small and were extinguished at night, leading to frigid mornings and a constant, bone-deep chill in every home. The ration was cut, and then cut again. Tempers grew short. A hacking cough became a common sound in the general store. Alara's life, by contrast, fell into a serene and efficient rhythm. Each morning, she would load the great iron stove with several large, slow-burning logs of cottonwood, a poor fuel by most standards, but one she had in abundance as no one else wanted it. This single firing would last for 8 to 10 hours. The stove itself kept her small cabin at a steady and comfortable 70 degrees. But the real magic was in the workshop. The heat, traveling through the insulated flue, saturated the tons of rock and earth packed around it. The stone bench remained warm for a full 24 hours after the fire had gone out, radiating a gentle, continuous heat that kept the large, uninsulated workshop at a remarkably stable 55 degrees. The small shed, warmed only by the floor register, stayed safely above freezing, protecting her stores. She consumed in one day what a normal household burned through in 3. Yet she heated a space 4 times as large. The townsmen who had mocked her now watched her with a mixture of suspicion and grudging curiosity. They saw that her chimney produced smoke for only a few hours a day, yet no frost ever formed on her windows. They saw her walking between her buildings in the deepest cold without a heavy coat. They could not understand it, and their pride prevented them from asking. Abernathy was the most vocal of the skeptics, eager to find a flaw. "It is a temporary trick of the earth," he declared to the men gathered around his own pot-belly stove at the store. "When the deep frost sets in, it will suck the heat from her pipe like a leech. The ground will freeze solid around it, and she will be worse off than any of us. Mark my words, by January, she will be begging for a share of the ration. He was wrong. December 18th brought a storm that dropped 2 feet of snow, and the temperature fell to 10 below zero. The deep frost set in, but instead of drawing the heat out, the frozen earth around her Flue, now insulated by a thick blanket of snow, only served to better contain the heat within her system. Her workshop remained a haven of steady, radiant warmth. She spent her days there, organizing the old blacksmith's tools, reading her grandfather's books, and enjoying a level of comfort that was now the rarest of luxuries in Prairie Ridge. The first death of the winter occurred on Christmas Eve. An elderly trapper living alone on the edge of town was found frozen in his bed, his last few sticks of wood lying unburned beside a cold stove. A somber mood fell over the community. The fear that had been a low hum in October was now a palpable presence. The ration was nearly gone, and people began burning fence posts, furniture, and the siding from their sheds. The smoke from their chimneys was thin and pale, a sign of weak, inefficient fires that barely held the killing cold at bay. On January 3, 1888, the sky took on a strange, bruised, yellowish-gray color, and the wind fell silent. The old-timers knew the sign. It was the calm before the storm, the deep breath a predator takes before it strikes. They called it a white hurricane. That evening, the first flakes began to fall, not swirling, but descending in a straight, determined, impossibly thick curtain. By morning, the world had vanished. The blizzard that struck Prairie Ridge was a meteorological event of historic proportions, a storm that would be spoken of for generations. The snow was not merely falling. It was being driven by a hurricane-force wind that screamed out of the north with a sound like a tearing fabric of reality. The temperature, which had been 5 below zero at midnight, plunged to 20 below, then 30, then an almost inconceivable 42 degrees below zero. The wind chill was a number that had no meaning, a lethal force that could freeze exposed flesh in less than a minute. Visibility was zero. To step outside was to be instantly blinded and disoriented in a maelstrom of white. The snow, as fine and sharp as sand, was driven into every crack and crevice of the poorly built cabins. It sifted under doors, through window frames, and down chimneys that were not drawing properly. The wind was a physical blow, a pressure that made the log walls of the houses groan and shudder. For the people of Prairie Ridge, the blizzard was an apocalypse. Their small, inefficient fires were no match for the assault. The ferocious wind howling over the rooftops created downdrafts in their chimneys, puffing smoke and soot back into the rooms and threatening to extinguish the flames altogether. To keep a fire going required standing next to the stove, feeding it constantly with whatever flammable material could be found. The houses themselves were bleeding heat from 1,000 tiny wounds. The walls leached warmth. The windows were opaque sheets of thick ice on the inside. The cold was an invading army, relentless and overwhelming. Josiah Abernathy sat in his own house, the largest in town, located directly behind his store. He had a large, modern stove, the most expensive model he sold, and what he had considered a generous private stock of seasoned oak. But the stove, for all its nickel-plated ornamentation, was devouring the wood at an astonishing rate, and the house remained dangerously cold. His wife and 2 young children were huddled together in one room, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Sometime in the afternoon of the second day, the impossible happened. A gust of wind, a solid wall of air moving at over 70 miles per hour, struck his chimney. The brickwork, poorly mortared by a cheap mason, gave way. A section of the chimney collapsed, sending a cascade of bricks and soot down into the stove, completely blocking the flue. A cloud of thick, choking smoke filled the room. The fire was dead. Panic set in. Without a fire, the house would become a tomb of ice within hours. The temperature inside was already plummeting. Abernathy, his face a mask of terror, tried to clear the blockage, but it was impossible. The stove was a useless block of cold iron. His children were crying, their breaths pluming in the air of their own living room. He looked at his wife, her face pale with fear, and he knew they were facing death. Their neighbors were in no better state. He could not risk taking his family out into the blinding, killing storm on the faint hope that someone else's fire was still burning. Then, through the howling of the wind, a thought, a memory, penetrated his fear-frozen mind. He remembered the girl, the fool, the one who had dug a tunnel in the dirt. He remembered her quiet confidence, the steady, thin plume of smoke he had seen rising from her chimney, day after day. He had called her a fool, had led the town in laughing at her. Now, the image of her warm, well-lit windows was a vision of paradise. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Survival was the only currency that mattered. "We are going to Alara's," he announced, his voice hoarse. "Wrap the children. Tie the rope around your waist. We must not get separated." Their journey of 50 yards was an epic trek through a polar hell. The wind tore at them, trying to rip the blankets from their bodies. The snow was waist-deep, a thick, suffocating powder that made every step an act of desperate exertion. Abernathy, leading the way, could see nothing, navigating by pure instinct, his face a raw, frozen mask. He bellowed Alara's name into the storm, the sound snatched away by the wind. He stumbled, fell, and hauled himself up, driven by the terrified cries of his children behind him. Finally, his outstretched hand hit something solid. Wood, the wall of a building. He fumbled his way along it, found the corner, and then another wall. He was at her property. He stumbled toward where he thought the cabin door should be and collapsed against it, hammering with his frozen fists. The door opened, and a wave of warm, clean air washed over him, a physical shock so profound it almost made him weep. Alara stood there, her silhouette framed by the gentle lamplight of the cabin. She was wearing a simple wool dress. Her feet were bare. She looked at the snow-caked figures, at the terrified, ice-rimmed eyes of Josiah Abernathy, the man who had publicly humiliated her. She saw his wife, clutching a whimpering child, and another small shape barely visible in the swirling snow. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not gloat. She did not hesitate. "Get inside," she said, her voice calm and even. "All of you, quickly." She helped them stumble over the threshold into the astonishing, life-giving warmth of her cabin. The air was a steady 70 degrees. The great iron stove radiated a powerful, comforting heat. She helped them out of their frozen coats and blankets, sat them down, and gave them hot broth. Abernathy could not speak. He could only stare at the stove, then at the girl, his mind struggling to reconcile the scene with his own rigid, foolish certainty. They were not the only ones. Over the next few hours, as the storm raged at its peak, others came. First, it was the Henshaws from next door, their own fire having failed. Then came Marcus Thorne, the blacksmith, who had tried to ride it out in his own shop and had nearly frozen. He arrived with the first stages of frostbite on his fingers and ears. One by one, and in small family groups, a total of 14 people, half of them children, made the desperate pilgrimage to Alara's homestead. They were the very men and the families of the men who had laughed the loudest. Her small cabin was crowded, but the workshop provided more than enough space. She led them through the connecting door into the vast, warm expanse. They stared in disbelief at the long, stone bench, which was warm to the touch, radiating heat into the enormous room. Children, who had been shivering uncontrollably minutes before, were soon sitting on it, their faces finally regaining color. The men walked the length of the building, placing their hands on the floorboards, feeling the gentle, impossible warmth rising from the earth itself. They looked at the single, quiet stove in the other room, then back at the vast, comfortable space around them, and the sheer, undeniable genius of what Alara had built finally dawned on them. It was a miracle born not of fantasy, but of physics. For 3 days, the blizzard raged. The world outside ceased to exist. But inside Alara's interconnected buildings, a small pocket of civilization endured. The 15 refugees and their hostess lived in a state of shared, surreal comfort. Alara's preparations were more than adequate. She had food, water from a well that was inside the workshop and thus did not freeze, and light from her kerosene lamps. The single stove, fed its steady diet of cottonwood logs, performed its task flawlessly, the heat moving silently through its subterranean artery, warming the 3 buildings as if they were one. On the morning of the 4th day, January 7th, the wind finally died. The silence was as stunning as the noise had been. When Alara opened the door, it was to a world transformed and entombed. The snow was piled in monstrous drifts, reaching the rooftops in places. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the air was lethally cold. But still, the sun shone on a landscape of pure, sculpted white. The survivors emerged from her home as if being reborn. The town of Prairie Ridge was barely recognizable. Only the peaks of the roofs were visible above the snow. What followed was a grim accounting. Rescue parties were formed, digging their way to the other houses. Of the 62 souls who had been in Prairie Ridge when the blizzard struck, 17 were dead. They were found in their homes, frozen in their beds or huddled around cold, useless stoves. An entire family of 5, the Millers, had perished, their cabin completely buried in a drift. Every single person who had not sought refuge in Alara's home and who had not had an unusually large and well-protected fuel supply had died. The 15 people she had saved owed her their lives. There was no public ceremony, no grand speech of apology from Josiah Abernathy. The vindication was quieter, more profound, and more complete than that. It was in the way they looked at her now, not as a child, but as a sage. It was in the silence that fell when she entered the general store. A silence not of dismissal, but of deep, abiding respect. Abernathy, a humbled and broken man, sold her whatever she needed at cost for the rest of his days. The other men who had scoffed now came to her, hats in hand, not with mockery, but with questions. They asked her to show them the plans, to explain the principles of thermal mass and draft. The following summer, under Alara's instruction, the men of the town worked together to build 2 more such systems. One connected the town hall, the schoolhouse, and the church. The other serviced a cluster of 4 homes on the main street. They dug the trenches, laid the clay pipes, and built the masonry radiators with the meticulous care of converts to a new religion. Alara supervised every step, her quiet authority now unquestioned. They were no longer just building heating systems. They were embedding a new kind of wisdom into the very foundation of their town, a wisdom that valued foresight over tradition and knowledge over noise. Her Flue of folly had become their charter of survival. She remained in Prairie Ridge for the rest of her long life, never a leader in title, but always the quiet, unshakable center of a community that had once laughed at her and now owed its very existence to the simple, profound truth she had understood: that the most powerful solutions are often hidden, buried deep in the earth and in the forgotten knowledge of the past.